There is no countdown for the broadcaster. You get the statement going live in the present continuous with a very ambiguous icon on the screen. All right, guys, we're going to have a conversation to kick this off about what, if anything, makes the West special, politically, philosophically, and otherwise. And I'm happy to take questions from the audience, if there is any audience, and if there are any questions, as has become our habit in just the last few days. This is a 100% unannounced and spontaneous live stream. So, Melissa, when did you first read Thucydides?
3 years ago.
Okay. Melissa, sitting off camera, 3 years ago, read Thucydides for the first time. And I assume you had never heard of Thucydides before you met me.
Never.
I mean, it would be one thing to say it's a name that's never spoken on the radio or never in newspaper headlines. But in the year 2021, in fact, the name is in newspaper headlines on the radio all the time. So you guys, shout out to Larry, first person to show up in our audience, spontaneous unannounced live stream. In the year 2021, since Joe Biden came into office, there has been a lot of talk about the Thucydides trap. Is a stupid idiom and completely needless piece of jargon, proposing that China and the United States have a relationship somehow analogous to, somehow comparable to the relationship between Sparta and Athens, and that there was a kind of inevitable war looming just because of the greatness of the two powers contesting their place in the world. Now, I think that's ridiculous, but that is something that puts Thucydides' name quite literally into newspaper headlines 2021. I think it is really worth questioning, sincerely, from a non-fascist perspective, what is the meaning of the West? What is special about the West? You know, obviously right-wingers and neo-Nazis and crap, they talk about the West as if it has some kind of intrinsic special moral superiority over other civilizations. And precisely because they're willing to take that for granted, they're not going to really examine it in a thoroughgoing or a sincere way. Now, I started off life left-wing. I was born left-wing and I was raised left-wing. My parents were not just leftists, they were communists. And I ended up becoming a rather harsh critic of communism. And I grew up in the shadow of genocide and the rise and fall of the British Empire here in Canada. So it is natural as a young man that I would be hostile to the notion that there is anything special about the West or Western democracy, right? So there's a comment from the audience from Sam. Sam says he finds it surprising that Melissa hadn't heard of Thucydides. He says he heard about Thucydides in his 8th grade world history class.
That's great.
Where did you go to school? I sure as hell didn't hear. I can tell you, sorry, it's a whole separate story. When did I first hear about Thucydides? I had a very peculiar professor in university who was from Iran. And he did not identify as a refugee, but he could be called an Iranian refugee. There's an interesting case. You know, do you identify as male or female? Well, you're persecuted and you fled the country, but you don't identify as a refugee, as a question. But he had been put in prison and tortured to some extent in Iran. It was torture light, you know what I mean? They didn't cut off any fingers or toes. But he was interrogated and treated badly in prisons there for being a kind of dissident intellectual. Interesting guy. And yeah, if you put his name into Google, you will find out things about him. So his first name was Ramin, Ramin, which is not a totally surprising name for an Iranian. And his last name is, it is unusual for someone from Iran. His last name is Jahanbeglu, which is spelled more like a Hindu name from India, but it's not. He's Iranian. I won't digress into why linguistically those are so similar, but they are. Sanskrit is very similar to Avestan, people. Okay, I keep saying that on these lives. I keep doing political to say, guys, Sanskrit is very similar to Avestan. Come on. Work on etymologies, people. Anyway, so Ramin Jahanbeglu was my professor. And, you know, he was the guy who introduced me to the philosophy of Max Stirner. And we talked a lot one-on-one as professor and student. We didn't just talk in class or something. And I knew a lot about his personal life and things. He was one of those professors who took me aside. And I think he was somewhat desperate to socialize with someone who was a real intellectual. He very explicitly told me that none of his colleagues were. None of the other professors were interested in politics or philosophy. None of them were real intellectuals. He was happy to take me aside. But anyway, he told me about Max Stirner and a number of other philosophers I did get interested in. But I remember he was the first person to ever mention Thucydides to me. And I just completely dismissed Thucydides. Like, pah, he's an historian. He's not a philosopher. He doesn't do political philosophy. I do philosophy. I do the philosophy of politics. Come on, you want to read this historian? And he didn't push back on that. You know, I remember Ramin, he was like, oh yeah, you know, you're quite right. I mean, you know, like he was acting as if like Aristotle and Plato are more worthy of your attention than Thucydides. But yeah, I hadn't read Thucydides. I was just dimly aware. He was considered the father of history. You know, sorry, the context in which I had first ever read the name Thucydides was in the discussion and critique of Hegel. So Herodotus and Thucydides and that stuff came up at that time. And then, yeah. So that's also shows when I was a young man, I was hostile to historians and the writing of history as such. And I still am. I mean, it's very hard. It's very dangerous to recommend to a young person that they go to the history section of the library and get a book off the shelf. It's mostly crap. And a lot of it's propaganda and a lot of it's misleading and ill-intentioned and stuff. You know, I mean, history as a department at the university is a parlous place. To myself, parlous. Okay. But I'm not dumb in it. If you don't know parlous, look it up. Okay. Anyway, yeah. This was a digression into how I first heard the name Thucydides in contrast to Melissa. But as a young man, I was raised to be left-wing, and I became very critical of my parents' political ideology as time went on. I saw the cracks in it and so on. I am still left of center by the American political compass, certainly. But if I were in some very left-wing country in Europe, I might not be left of center because center is different from place to place. I don't know. I don't know how I'd do in Sweden. I suppose, well, maybe we'll find out. Maybe season 2 of Abalasion will be filmed in Sweden. But before a live studio audience, too. I mean, let's get ourselves a studio in Stockholm. In the old days, I used to have more viewers per capita in Sweden than any other country. I don't think that would be true today, but back when I was doing videos about veganism, when that was the main thing, was vegan politics, Sweden was my most overrepresented source of my audience, because their population is small. So if you looked at viewers per capita for that country, they were number one for me. So look, growing up left-wing, it's one of those things where you'd say, is there something special about the West? And it's very easy, if you are sympathetically inclined, to say no, that there's nothing special. Now, partly that's based on optimism. Like you look at what the Western world has accomplished and you say, hey, Syria can accomplish that too. There's nothing special. There's no trick to it. The Syrian people can have a democratic, pluralistic society, and newspapers that criticize the government and people that stand for they can really easily catch up with it. Anybody can do it, right? Look at the Japanese. The Japanese don't share our tradition or our history or whatever. They were able to create this modern system. Look at Taiwan. Look at South Korea. So if you look at it in that way, you can say, look, democracy, and put it this way, not just democracy. The redeeming qualities of Western civilization were things that the Japanese, the Taiwanese, and the South Koreans were able to generate themselves without having access to any kind of special heritage or tradition in the Western world. They certainly did it without reading Thucydides or Aristotle or Plato or any of that. So why would we delude ourselves as the right wing are wont to do, as you know, especially white nationalists and fascists and what have you, and outright racists want to think that way. So that's one, and obviously that's not all wrong. There's some sense in which I'm sympathetic with that, and optimistically, I'd like to think that any country in Africa, any country in the Middle East or something, can very easily take advantage of all the redeeming qualities of the so-called West. Now, I'm going to challenge this idea of the West with the next example, especially. Why is Mexico... Dramatic pause. This is unedited, people. This is like... Why is Mexico so much poorer than the United States of America today? Why is the quality of government in Mexico so much worse than the United States today? All right. Historically, guys, you may not know this. Mexico had silver. Mexico had oil, i.e. gasoline. Mexico has, I'm going to go on a limb here. I'm going to say Mexico has the world's greatest climate for agriculture. Find one that's better. They're right on that cusp where it's not all the way tropical, but there's also not really any winter. It's that temperate, hot temperate climate with great soil, right? And for a lot of America's history, when you look at like the 13 colonies period, Mexico and the Spanish Empire in that part, they had more population, they had all kinds of advantages. They were part of this great world empire that was managed quite well compared to the American 13 colonies or whatever, Mexico had all kinds of advantages, say 200 years ago. They had all kinds of advantages 400 years ago too, by the way. In terms of the indigenous people, there were great cities in the area that's now Mexico under indigenous people. We did not have great cities comparable to the Inca and the Olmec and so on, here in the west coast of Canada, for example. It's a big contrast. Mexico seems like on a continental scale, on a global scale, you seem to have all these advantages. Why does Mexico lack precisely the advantages that we pretend are innate or inherent to, or part and parcel of this thing we call the West, Western civilization? Now, how about we get even more challenging? Greece. Greece from 2008 to 2021. Why is it that Greece seems to lack the advantages of the West? Right? And of course, Greece is a definitive part of the West. People say about Greece, say about Spain. They're these kind of sick men of Europe, these kind of failed states within Western Europe. And, what we mean by the West and the advantages of the West, actually, it's quite difficult to tease out. Which I shouldn't say this to tease out. This is really kind of technical jargon. It's difficult for us to really be honest with ourselves and others what we mean when we're talking about the Western world, let alone when we get into a comparative framework talking about Japan or China, ancient and modern. Another great example is India, Sri Lanka. Wonderful talk about. All right, so I'm going to read some stuff going on in the chat for a minute. Junebug says, good evening. I wonder what time it is there because I'm in bed. Well, Junebug, let me talk to you through this. All right. The earth may appear to the naked eye to be flat, but it is in fact an imperfect sheer spheroid shape passing through the depths of space. And that is why when the sun shines on one side of the globe, it is not visible on the other. It's sorry to break this to you. This is May 19th, 2021. If the world were flat, it would indeed be peculiar that the sun is shining here and not. So Lydia asks, I wonder if Lydia is asking this because she's single. Lydia admitted in our last live stream that she moved back in with her parents and got pissed off with them and moved back out. So Lydia, I am wondering if you have a dog in this fight. If you have to say, Lydia asks, are you and Melissa getting married any day soon? Not any time soon, any day soon. So an interesting question. Another profound question. Do you like George Carlin? No. So that's it's kind of one of the weird litmus tests, I think. Back in the old days in this channel, people used to insult me by calling me a pseudo-intellectual, which I always found hilarious. I actually made some videos joking about that, what a hilarious and hollow comment that is. I have to say, I think the people who love and look up to George Carlin in this world, I think they really are pseudo-intellectuals. And an example would be, the Amazing Atheist. The Amazing Atheist worships George Carlin and looks up to him and stuff. And no, for someone like me, George Carlin is really a somewhat pitiable. He's not great as a comedian. He's certainly not great as a social commentator or political person. Do you guys want to say about George Carlin? I mean, you're too young for him. I mean, your generation.
I've seen a couple of his.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit of comedy on YouTube.
Right. Well, I was just saying, Melissa is 28, so she's of the generation where George Carlin was being recycled on YouTube in short clips.
Like pictures online with his quotes or something like that. That's what I've seen.
Anyway, just say no. But in my day, George Carlin was something people actually watched on a VHS cassette for 2.5 hours or something. Or I think he did HBO broadcasts and stuff too. So there was a time, and there was a whole generation for him. That was a big deal. And, so Junebug says, Melissa needs her own live stream for us ladies. Junebug, are you really so naive? You don't think the vast majority of Melissa's viewers are men? Really? Really? Let's keep it all the way real. Even, I just shaved before broadcasting, so I got a little bit of dried blood in the end of my chin. So I'll keep that's not great either. Keep my head looking straight forward so you can't see the dried blood on my chin from shaving. All right, my shaving scars, you might say. Okay, So, what is special about the West, and how does the reading of these big definitive tomes like Thucydides, Aristotle, and Plato fit into that? What, if anything, is special about the West? Why would we look for and why would we discover some criterion, something that's special about the West? Well, as I got older, I didn't just become left-wing. I actually gained a profound level of education about the politics and history of India, the politics and history of Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, eventually China, eventually Japan. Those are relatively recent years, really, that I got into that history. But you start to have a comparative framework where you will notice increasingly what is special about those Western texts, those Western sources, Western politics, Western philosophy. Now, if you lack that, I mean, it is really ridiculous, whether you're left-wing or right-wing, conservative or liberal. It's ridiculous to ask children to recognize what's special about America if they have nothing to compare it to. Now, even if you just have the comparison of America and Mexico, if you have a family that's going back and forth between America and Mexico, you'd start to notice some things and appreciate things. So you'd be like, oh, wow, here in America, people complain that the police are corrupt. But in Mexico, when they talk about police corruption, that's a whole other story. So that gives, now you see police corruption in the United States in a different way. Well, people complain that this and that doesn't work in the government in America, but people even complain the government's going bankrupt in America. But in Mexico, when we talk about the government going bankrupt, it's a whole other thing. That's only one comparison, right? So you might start to gain some awareness. But for someone like myself, as life goes on, probably I began with a comparative awareness looking at Canada versus Europe. But then with a lot of reading, you're starting to compare Europe to India, Europe to, and Canada, Europe to Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia. I mean, northern Southeast Asia. I've never been seriously interested in places like Indonesia and Malaysia, I just mentioned. Muslim Southeast Asia does not interest me very much. But Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, China, Japan, you start building out this way. So now when I read, say, Lord Shang, I just mentioned, if you guys don't know how to spell Lord, come on, it's the easiest Chinese name in the world. Lord space Shang. If you check Wikipedia, you get an okay article. I'm like, it's not genius, but there is a respectable Wikipedia article telling you Lord Shang is one of the most famous and influential political philosophers in the history of Chinese politics or philosophy or both, or the history of Chinese history itself. When you are reading Lord Shang, there are a lot of really important themes and questions that are just totally absent, And those themes and questions in the ancient Greek literature and the ancient Roman literature are present. They're prominent. They're a big deal. Now, you guys might feel this way about an issue like slavery or whether or not women have the right to vote. Like you could be reading any ancient text and be like, well, why aren't they talking about slavery or why aren't they talking about women having the right to vote? And, with a lot of Western texts, European texts or something, it might be in there as kind of something briefly mentioned or covered up or something. Of course, there are some that deal with it in depth, but you might be disappointed if you're reading political philosophy from any given century. It's like, well, what seems to us as modern readers to be such a prominent, important thing? In the Chinese texts, in the texts from ancient India, so on and so forth, all of the non-Western texts, including, we're not even dealing with the Islamic world. I didn't include Arabia in this. Which I have studied, by the way. Again, shout out to Professor Ramin Jahanbegloo. Professor Ramin Jahanbegloo from Iran, he was my first professor teaching me about the politics of the Muslim world. And I say that intentionally. So that included Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, I admit we didn't include Indonesia. It didn't go all the way out to the furthest limits. We didn't do Northwest Africa, but it was a large part of the Muslim. Egypt made a big impression on me, studying the politics of Egypt. Yeah. So if you want to talk about the history of so-called Muslim jurisprudence and these kinds of things and make that comparison, why is it that it's just in this one special place in the world that we really have this profound tradition of thinking about and examining, like, one, how is government supposed to work? And then two, what is the role of the people in it? Now, we could digress here that the concept of the people is not the same in all times and all places. It's not the same in all cultures. It moves around. During the period of time when the American Revolution unfolds in the drafting of the American Constitution, it is obvious to everyone that the people only includes Christian white men. And a small number of people were challenging that. There were people who were in favor of equality for blacks. There were people who were in favor of equality for women. But the vast majority of people participating in those debates, their idea of the people was some people and not others. Now, the other thing in the British tradition, the American tradition, is also the property qualification. They were deeply committed to the idea that people who were poor, people who did not own property, did not deserve to have a voice in government. Okay, so you can note that too. But back in Athens and back in Rome, they were deeply committed to the idea that the people, even the poor, had to have some stake in government. They had to have some kind of positive role and positive involvement in government. So to be fair to Rome, I often say that Rome was sort of much worse than Athens in every way as a system of political government. And I sometimes say that because that's how I feel. But, you know, Rome didn't just have the tribunes to represent the poor. So there were the tribunes of the poor, for the poor, whatever you want to say. There were these representatives of the poor. The tribunes reported back to a type of parliament or a type of pnyx or a type of plenary that was for the poor. They had their own congress, if you like, for the poorer classes that would meet. Now, to my knowledge, there's relatively little documentation of that because history was written by the rich. But it's sort of mentioned in passing. It's like, oh yes, the tribune arrived kind of with these notes having been gathered from the meeting with the poor, you know, that there was this separate kind of Congress or Senate for the poor. Now, its only formal power was to have the tribune, or tribunes, plural, represent their interests in front of the Senate, to come and veto what was going on in the Senate and debate it. However, you can imagine, informally, they had all kinds of power because if they want to, they can burn the city down. They can get order. They can burn the city down. They can sabotage the war or whatever. They can be the difference between winning or losing a war, or the economy succeeding or failing. So, you know, the Senate knew, even if they worked through the tribunes as intermediaries, they had to placate and make happy this representation of the poor. Now, okay, so we're already getting at part of my answer to this question. Without assailing the history of Chinese political philosophy, the history of Muslim political philosophy, but guys, it's all bad. I mean, if you want to take the time, if you want, I enjoy reading Lord Shang. I enjoy reading anyone who said, "Oh yeah, the philosophy of Lord Shang still has like meaning and applicability today." You have to be insane. You have to be insane. I mean, the political and philosophical history of China is only worth studying to understand why China was so screwed up in the way it was in past centuries. It's important for understanding the history of China. It has absolutely no value to add to our political organization or function. None. Zero. Now, I would say the same about Muslim jurisprudence. We tend to always say jurisprudence rather than political science in the Islamic world. But yeah, you want to know how Sharia law works? Melissa was just reading about that in Central Asia. What's your impression? I mean, you know, the only people who think that still has a place in the modern world are ISIS, are the really extreme Islamic terrorists. They want to go back to Sharia law and ruled by Muslim jurisprudence. It was absolutely terrible. And by the way, India and Pakistan, they're very much part of that history too, linguistically and culturally different, but they also have their own history, this kind of terrible brutality of Muslim rule. So look, oops, turn the light off next there. Okay, I'll glance at some questions from the audience here before we proceed. So I got a question. What do you think of Nathan Rich? Is he thinking of the Chinese rapper? Remember that guy?
No, it was Rich Brian.
Yeah. Oh, Rich Brian. No. Okay. I've never, to my knowledge, I've never heard the name Nathan Rich before. Whoever asked the question. Oh, we have a profound question. Abala ciel. What does that mean? And the next question is tearing down the walls. I think that's a provocative suggestion, but no, it does not mean tearing down the walls. It has this sense of being like tear heaven out of the sky. So very literally, yeah, to tear down the sky. But yeah, this sense of tear down heaven or tear heaven out of the sky. And it was a political slogan at several different points in French political history, you know, chanted in protests and comes up spontaneously because people would sometimes say abat l'état, tear down the government, tear down the state. And sometimes they'd say tear down the church or tear down a particular leader, you know, abat le blank. You got different things to make. But then the more extreme form, whatever people were saying, was "Abat le ciel." So like, no, I'm not chanting "Abat l'État." I'm not saying I want to take down the current government. I want to take heaven out of the sky. So we get an answer about Nathan Rich. So I just say it comes up as a sort of intentionally exaggerated political slogan in different French revolutions and uprisings. So we get an answer. Nathan Rich is a political commentator on China on YouTube. He is essentially a spokesperson for the CCP. Well, I'm not very sympathetic. I mean, the other problem is, look, the Communist Party itself is one thing. The freelance propaganda people do on its behalf when they're pandering to what they think the Communist Party wants to hear is really, really bad. If you want to read real Communist Party propaganda, the website to look up is Qiu, Qiu space SHI. Most Western people don't know about that, but there is an English language edition of Qiu, and that is the official political science journal, political philosophy journal of the government of China, where they tell you what they want you to think. And in some ways, it's very honest. I mean, I know that's going to sound weird, but honesty comes from strength, right? And when you're in a position of unassailable power, you can be honest with people because they can't hurt you. There can't be any negative consequences for you. So you will actually find a lot of strange honesty in the pages of Chosha magazine about what's going on to the government. That you can learn something from that. But watching these guys, whether they're white guys or Chinese immigrants to the United States of America who are out here doing freelance work, it's really bad. You don't, yeah. So somebody is saying there's a lot of this. Oh, shout out to Melora. Shout out to everyone showing up in the audience. I always wonder. I wonder if anyone will ever, for anyone, if this will be their first introduction to my channel. If anyone will show up and watch one of these live streams, where the entire audience is normally, it's comprised of people who've already known me for like 7 years. There are people who've known me for so many years. And by the way, also, I mean, I'm sympathetic to this. I used to say this years ago on the channel. There are people who have spent more time listening to my voice than they've spent listening to their cousins or nieces or nephews or even their brothers or sisters' voices. Like if you think about it, in the last 5 years, how many hours have you spent listening to Abat le ciel? How many hours have you spent listening to your brother talk about politics, talk about personal life, talk about anything? So I know there are people in the audience who've really, really gotten to know me. But anyway, yeah. But I would be interested to know for anyone they're stepping in midstream in more ways than one. Okay, so look, what makes the West special, or in what sense should we grudgingly admit that the West is special? Well, I think what most people want to overlook or not want to deal with is exactly the issue of social class in the history of ancient Rome and ancient Greece. Now, the idea of social class has become tarnished because Marxists won't shut up about it, and Marxists won't stop justifying mass murder with it, right? A lot of ideas get discredited by mass murder. But when you're talking about social class in Aristotle or Cicero or Thucydides, whether it's ancient Athens or ancient Rome, you are not talking about the Marxist idea of social class. You're not talking about Marxist excuses for massacring and persecuting people based on social class, nor are you talking about ideas that came out of the French Revolution, prior to Marxism, but still many, many centuries, countless centuries after ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So today we talk about the people, and then we sometimes talk about particular elites. Now, it is peculiar that in the American tradition, and the American tradition has now influenced the whole world, governments do not think they need to have representation for elites, and they should. Just to give you an example, how many surgeons are represented in government? How many nurses are represented in government? Those are people with special expertise. And I mean, right now, look what's happening in the world in 2021. The opinions and perspectives of doctors and nurses are really important. Well, you should probably have seats in parliament or seats in your Congress that are reserved to elect a certain number of senior experienced medical professionals. It probably in several different areas of expertise. And they probably should be elected, not appointed. And they should have to debate. You should have to have elections where they say, oh, no, I think I'm the best surgeon to represent the people's interests. And they'll say, I'm not corrupt. I didn't sell out to the pharmaceutical companies like you did. They should probably get up there and really dispute that. So my point is here, elites are not necessarily evil. and having representation for political elites in government is not necessarily evil. We do not have that in any of the modern so-called democracies, so-called representative democracies, raising the question of who are you representing? If you have a system of Congress or a system of parliament that only represents wealthy lawyers, what the hell is the point of having representative government? And I'm sorry, let's keep it straight. Bill Clinton and his wife were both wealthy lawyers. Now, in my opinion, based on, I also think they were genuinely corrupt, genuinely criminal lawyers. I've made a couple of videos saying that I do believe some of the bad things people say about Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton. By the way, it doesn't mean he was a bad president. I mean, he's a terrible human being. Now, when you look back at the 20th century, compare Bill Clinton to, Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush or something. Nobody is going to remember Bill Clinton as the worst president of his era or of his century. No, he's going to be remembered relatively positively in terms of this issue. Terrible human being though. And my point is just, if you have a system of government that only represents that one elite, that only represents corrupt lawyers or wealthy lawyers, are any of them really untainted by corruption? The people who get elected in the system? Well, where are the medical doctors? Where are the nurses? Where are the school teachers? Where are the university professors? Those are all people with particular vested interests and perspectives. Where are certain kinds of scientists whose opinions you might really want to represent in government? How about people who know about sewage treatment, or the environment under a couple different headings? You might think about those. Those might be people you want to have in the room and elected, not appointed, because if you appoint them, you're just going to appoint people who agree with what the government already wants to do. What about people who are experts in fishing and fisheries? Now, I'm vegan. From as far as I'm concerned, we can abolish fishing. But you might have people who know about fishing and hunting and habitat conservation. We have none of that. The only form of expertise we have is exactly the kind of expertise Bill Clinton had again and again and again. And what you get across the spectrums are different flavors of Bill Clinton. You get a relatively left-wing Bill Clinton and a relatively right-wing Bill Clinton, but all of them have come out of this same kind of elite law school background again and again and again. So this is, now I'm only talking about the upper half of representation, right? Where is the representation for the poor, right? Where is the representation for indigenous people, for First Nations, for the Navajo, for the Cree, for the Ojibwe, where? And it never has been there. I mean, historically, you go back over the decades and centuries. It's not just that it's not there. This ain't something new that just came in. Gee, we call this representative government. Nobody is represented. Isn't that interesting? There's no actual interest in representation or who's being represented or why. Interesting. So maybe we don't have representational government. Maybe we have senatorial government. And who and what is the Senate is worth talking about. But this is my point. When we look back at the uniqueness of the West, of what made the West special as a political idea or political movement, when we look at Thucydides and we look at Rome also, right, we're looking at societies that self-consciously and intentionally designed their systems of government to represent multiple social classes, right? These are the rich, these are the poor, and these are several gradients of rich and poor in between. Now, they also, so in Athens especially, in Rome was a little bit different, but not that much different. But in Athens, they also divided each of the social strata into tribes. And when people are first reading ancient Greek texts like Aristotle, they're discussing this, they don't really know what the word tribe means. It doesn't mean tribalism in our sense. It was a quite artificial thing. You were basically different neighborhoods or whatever had different teams invented to represent them in government. So you had an affiliation with your social class, which very explicitly meant your level of wealth. And you had this deme identity, this affiliation with your neighborhood, with your tribe. And again, it's a totally phony government-created tribe where just everybody gets assigned to a different tribe kind of thing. It doesn't represent your ancestry or your ethnicity or whatever. And then also, you would all your life carry a special fraternity, a special brotherhood because of the year that you commenced doing your military service. The men who were inducted into the military with you served in the military starting the same year you did. You'd remember that. I started in the year such and such when so-and-so was in charge of the army. He swore me into the army. And you met with those guys and had lunch with them every so often. Lunch or dinner. But you had ceremonial occasions where you met up with your war buddies your whole life. So already you get the sense of how powerful the social cohesion was, the bonds of sentiment. Okay. Now, why? Why did they have this system of different social strata being represented in government. Okay. It was not out of the goodness of their hearts. It was not because of some kind of Marxist theory about, I don't know, what's good for the rich or good for the poor or something. It wasn't out of some, okay. It fundamentally was about taxation and motivating people to pay their taxes. Now, maybe there is some exception to the generalization I'm going to make, but I'm going to tell you something. I don't know it. Most societies all over the world, societies other than Athens and Rome, most of them had a fundamentally punitive system of taxation where you have some kind of despot or tyrant who's trying to tax you. And if you don't pay your taxes, he's going to beat you up, or he's going to put you in prison, or he's going to steal your wife or something, where it is based just on coercion and threat. Now, in the ancient world, there were no computers, right? There were no credit cards. There's no way to really track and trace what you're buying and selling. It's not easy for the government in the ancient world to say, okay, well, you're a farmer. This is how many tons of wheat you produced, and this is how much that's worth, and here's the percentile value of the tax you should be paying. That kind of calculation is very, very difficult to do, even if people are being honest with you. And they're not. People are going to lie. Obviously, the easiest thing in the world, whether you are mining gold or farming olives off of your olive tree, the easiest thing in the world to do is to lie about how much money you're making, how much you're farming, how much wool you are spinning, how many clothes you're producing, how many sails you are sewing out of hemp, what is the financial value of the pots you are baking in an oven. How is the government going to tax you? Well, one answer is the majority of planet Earth, the majority of history was the government is going to terrorize you. The government is going to interrogate you and threaten you with torture. And they're going to send soldiers every so often. And they are going to try to force you to pay your taxes out of fear that if you don't comply, your life will be ruined. That is one answer. Okay. And the answer that Athens and Rome came up with instead is, you should be proud to pay your taxes, because we have at any given time, it's something like 5 or 6 social strata. It's a little bit different, 5, 6, or 7 levels of how wealthy you are. And if you're in one of those middle levels and you start making more money, you should be proud to honestly account how much money you have and then start paying the higher level of taxes so that you can move up in the political system to being represented in that level of government. See? Now we see why. Now we see why the people in Rome and Athens were divided into social classes and why they competed with one another. They vied with one another to move up the ladder and to pay more taxes. So we even see this with burials in terms of archaeology. You know, the best evidence you can ever get is a tombstone and this kind of thing. They really last through history. We have tombstones of people who say proudly, I was born, okay, this is actually a real example. I remember reading this in a book. But anyway, I was born in the second lowest social class. You know, so there's like the absolute poorest of the poor, and I was one up from that. And I worked hard, and this was my business, and this was my, I did X, Y, and Z in the marketplace. And by the time I died, I had gotten up to the highest social class. I had moved up the ranks. You know, this is business. He was proud of this. It was what was inscribed in rock on his tombstone. But I was going to say, sometimes you have other stories where it's like, hey, my father was born in the lowest class. I moved up 2 social classes, and my son, he's going to be in the ekes or whatever. He's going to be a knight. He's going to be a horseman, whatever, right? And your social class, it was reflected in, again, sometimes who you ate lunch with, who you ate dinner with, what ceremonial occasions you attended, what festivities and religious occasions you attended, or if the same festivity was happening everywhere, you wouldn't go to the celebration for the plebs, for the poor. You'd go to this one for the elite. You get to go to different dinner parties, which, by the way, you can see that already in Plato. They cared a lot about going to fancy dinner parties. People still do to some extent. You would get to go to different kinds of social occasions. You'd be recognized the way. You would get to participate in government, inform government in a different way. And the biggest one of all, right, is military service. Because that ultimately, that's where the ego trip stops, right? Now we're talking about life and death, right? So if you were in a lower social class, you might be stuck rowing the boat, right? It's a good exercise, right? Okay, but these are ancient times. You might be one of the guys on the oars right? In a tyranny, rowing the boat, you might have a lower duty in the military. If what you wanted, maybe you don't want this, but a lot of people do. If what you wanted was to be wearing a gleaming, beautiful suit of armor and to go into battle in a cape, if you wanted to have that aristocratic bearing in war and do those aristocratic things and those higher duties, and now, you tell me whether your chances of surviving are greater or worse. I would imagine, anyway, you might die a more dignified death. When it came to war, now your social class matters. And it doesn't just matter for you. It matters for your sons, right? Because your son, like if you're already a middle-aged man, your sons are going to go to war. If you're an old man, right, your sons and your grandsons. It matters for your daughters because it changes who your daughters get to marry. These were totally gender unequal societies, don't get me wrong, but the single most important thing in a woman's life was who she would get to marry. So if you move up in social class, So yes, people did move up and people did move down. It always stuck with me that it was said of Sylla, the dictator, really his name is Sulla, so Sylla or Sulla, that he was born to rented rooms on an upper floor. So in Rome, they did have apartment buildings. I don't know if they went up 3 floors or 4 floors. I don't think they could go up 10 stories or something. They didn't have the technology for that. But if you lived in an apartment in ancient Rome, the most desirable place to be was on the ground floor. And the reason for that was water. If you lived on the upper floor, you were constantly going downstairs to get a bucket of water. And there were no plastic buckets. So this would be an earthenware jar, a heavy jar. You have to fill it with water and you have to go up. This is good exercise. But this was a mark of poverty, urban poverty, that Sulla became the dictator, became the leader of Rome, one of the most influential boards, but he was born to rented rooms on an upper floor. So yeah, there was social mobility and there was pride in being able to move up. And to do that, you had to pay more taxes, right? So if you lived out in the middle of the jungle, so to speak, if you had no contact, if you weren't downtown in Athens or downtown in Rome, if you lived out in the wilderness somewhere and you were making a lot of money, again, hashtag not vegan, if you were making a lot of money raising sheep and then taking the wool from the sheep and processing the wool and something, you could have a business out somewhere that has no contact with the urban city. You can lie to everyone about how much money you make. You could stockpile a huge amount of a fortune in gold coins or whatever the medium is, and nobody knows about it and you're not celebrated, not respected. But if you want to be celebrated and respected in the society of your fellow man, now you have to come to the city, and the proof of how much money you made is that you pay taxes. So again, you guys, whatever, if it's 10%, say, oh yeah, well, I made $1 million. Okay, well, you prove that by paying your 10% of money. You pay that by making your contribution. And by the way, I have seen different indications of this. To my knowledge, when you're talking about ancient Greece and Rome, the amounts of money were not fixed in percentages this way. To my knowledge, maybe some new research has shown something else in this, but normally I believe it was fixed in military terms, that it was like you have to give enough money for a suit of armor to completely furnish with arms and armor one hoplite, or you have to give enough. You have to either give us a war horse or enough money to buy and raise, like to add a horse to the army. That the levels of taxation were in this way, palpable things the military needed. Like you would pay money, but the amount of money being paid would be in this way linked to military sums. Maybe now there's been some new, One other thing before we go on, Machiavelli, who's much more important for the political history of the West than anyone wants to admit he was. And this is the book to read by Machiavelli. You won't read it cover to cover because just being honest, not every page of it is interesting. But so maybe 25% of this is really interesting and 75% of it you're going to flip through. But the 25% that's interesting is really interesting. Machiavelli's Discourses on Livy, a much more important book than The Prince by Machiavelli. And long. If I had The Prince out here, it looks like a pamphlet by contrast. Machiavelli is alive at a time when he said quite correctly that the era of city-states is now over, that the era of the world being ruled by tiny places like Athens and Rome is now over, that we're going to live in an era now with large countries like France or Germany, the United States. And his reasoning for this is interesting. His reasoning is that it's because of artillery. That now we have artillery shells that can go a long way. So it is impossible for a walled city-state like Athens was to be of any importance or security. You can't do that anymore. Now you have to have a big country. Okay. So interesting perspective from Machiavelli. Here's the counter argument. Places like Athens and Rome, precisely because they were small in this way, had almost infinite tax revenue because they were taxing all the trade that came in and out of the city. So just says the most common pattern in economic development, what people call third world development city, is the center periphery pattern, right? You see this all over the world. You see this even within the United States of America or Canada. Normally, you have one city that's wealthy, and that's where the harbor is, or that's where the trade is. So if you have a landlocked country, it'll be the city that's on the train line. It's where, or on the river where the boats, unload and where the train loads up and stuff. This is true of Laos, by the way. The only money is on the train line on the river, where the river meets the train line, in fact. But anyway, with most countries that are not landlocked, okay, so you got one or two cities that are on the coast, and that's where all the boats dump their goods and load up to leave with other goods. And at that point where trade takes place at the harbor, then there's all this tax revenue for the government coming in and out, right? And then the periphery, you have a rural hinterland that is more or less deprived, more or less poor. So in a modern country like Canada, how is it that electricity and running water and so on are provided to our rural periphery? Well, we tax the people in the big city, and then we spend that tax money improving life for people on the rural periphery. This is in third world countries, it's a real struggle, and you get into a lot of problems because of the extremes of wealth and poverty can be difficult for everyone to endure. You solve this problem with a city like Athens in ancient Greece because all the tax money just stays there in Athens. There are people in the surrounding periphery. There are people in Boeotia. That's the British pronunciation of Boeotia. Ridiculous mispronunciation. But anyway, the actual Greek pronunciation says, but anyway, there are people in surrounding provinces, Attic provinces and Boeotia and so on, these other surrounding principalities. And they're farming and they're producing finished goods. They're manufacturing things, and they're bringing those things to Athens to be sold or to be exported. Some of those things are going to be exported to Egypt, and they're going to import things through Egypt. And all the tax revenue is being generated in Athens, and it's all being spent in Athens. They're drowning in tax money. They have lots of money to spend, right? And that rural periphery gets nothing, right? Well, they get the farmers get the money there, but they're not producing a wealthy government with those advantages. So this is also a big part of, look, why was Athens successful? This also explains why they were a failure. Like they were in some ways really successful, and they were in some ways a failure. This formula has some advantages and disadvantages. Now, so Machiavelli is the turning point. Once you recognize that, okay, so Machiavelli is alive in Italy at a time when Italy is divided into these small principalities like Venice and Florence. They're bigger than city-states. They're not just a city, but they're a city with a little bit of surrounding countryside. One that still exists today, by the way, guys, is San Marino. So I don't know if you guys know the tiny state of San Marino. We got some Little B fans in the audience. Someone who remembers my videos about Little B. Those are, I could unlist my videos about Little B. I could self-censor on that. So Machiavelli is living at the end of this period of history and saying, well, we need to expand and have large principalities, large countries, right? Well, when you do that, now the wealth and tax revenue you're generating, now that is going to be dissipated. So you still are generating the wealth and tax revenue in a few places like New York City and Boston in the United States, a few places like Athens and Rome. But even today, even modern Greece, they don't have enough tax money. Today, 2021, Greece is still teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Well, still, the same harbor Socrates used to walk around and philosophize at, the Piraeus harbor in Athens, that is still their biggest harbor. That's where all their economic activity is. That's where the Chinese ships land and unload their goods and put them onto a train line that goes straight north, by the way. That's it. You got this one little place that generates some wealth. The rest of Greece is poverty-stricken. Slight simple. Thessaloniki, I guess, has a little bit of money. But most of Greece, most of the interior is poor, and they've got to take this tax money generated from just one place of that. Now we got to build schools everywhere. Now we got to build hospitals everywhere. Now we got to provide doctors and nurses everywhere. So this is also a very fundamental difference in terms of tax revenue. So, I mean, the basis for government, the basis for politics isn't voting, isn't popular democracy, isn't sovereignty. It's taxation. Government comes from taxation, right? That's it. And that's also the difference between having a government and just having a tribe. You can have a tribe of people that, we did for thousands of years, and in a few places in the world still this. There's no taxation. There's compulsory military service, and everyone has to do whatever the tribal chieftain says. And so there's, you can call this a government, but the fundamental difference is there is neither liberty nor taxation. When you have government, the government says you, in effect, do whatever you want. You have freedom, but whatever you do, we're going to tax a percentage of it. And with that, so this is very different from living in a tribal society where you don't have the freedom to do whatever you want to do, and your labor is directly compelled by your political leaders, the tribal chieftain or religious leader or whatever it may be. So that is the fundamental shift to government. So that is my Athens. The riddle, sorry, that is my Athens. Fair enough. That is my solution to the riddle of what is so special about the Western world in terms of political democracy. We went through these phases of development. So I was going to say, Thucydides for me personally is a big part of this, of understanding this, reading Thucydides. And Thucydides is anti-democracy, by the way. Thucydides is one of the many authors who is just constantly saying democracy is bad and wrong. He's telling you all the disadvantages of democracy. He's the world's harshest critic of democracy. But we can still read it and see the advantages of democracy. We can see how important it is. But, Melissa was with me when I read this book by the guy with such a long name, Numa. Jesus Christ. Am I going to get this guy's name right? The Ancient City. His name right. Numa Denis Fustel de Coulanges. La Cité Antique by Numa Denis Fustel de Coulanges. It's a very long name for a book. I am not recommending this book, really. I'm really not. But I just mentioned that's a book. I could digress a little bit to contrast this with my thesis. Okay, so let's just restate my thesis real briefly here. When you look at China, when you look at India, when you look at non-Western civilizations that have a well-documented political history, where we have writing about what happened there over centuries and over thousands of years, because you don't have that for the whole world. Cambodian political history is relatively brief. We have to guess what was going on in Cambodia 500 years ago from just a few pieces of stone that are inscribed. Okay, look at the Philippines, huge inhabited area. I'm going to say still a huge percentage of the human beings on planet Earth are Filipino, but good luck figuring out. I mean, we don't have a literature of political philosophy from the Philippines. But I'm guessing it wasn't good. I mean, so we don't have this kind of record that we have for Greece, China, India, and so on. Japan, it could be on this list too or something, right? When you look at these other non-Western civilizations, I am saying they did not go through this unique developmental stage that happened in Athens and Rome, largely by accident, I'm sure. We could get into the different factors that why it happened and when it happens, but whatever. Where they started a stratified system of representational government. They started having democracy, yes, which was taxing people in this way and positively motivating people to pay their taxes by recognizing their social status in government accordingly. So it was a dynamically unequal system of democracy. It wasn't democracy on the basis of human equality. It was democracy based on a kind of voluntary inequality, because they wanted you to voluntarily pay your taxes in a time when there were no bank accounts and there were no credit cards. There was no way to track and trace how much money you were spending or earning. They wanted you to step up and, in a sense, pay as much as you could in taxes towards you. So those factors came together. And then people started philosophizing about it. And to keep it all the way real with you, I feel like the most brilliant minds in Rome never really understood what Athens had done right. I'm just being honest with you. I don't think anyone in Rome ever really got it all the way. Anyway, the guy with the long name I just mentioned. I'm going to read some questions from the audience, guys. I see you buzzing in here in the audience. Numa Denis Fustel de Coulanges. he instead he instead presents a developmental model of how we ended up with Greek and Roman civilization. And it's significant to note he tries to claim that India had the same thing, which it doesn't. I mean, it's just dishonest. But he tries to claim that ancient India and ancient Iran had the same development. Now, ethno-linguistically, there are reasons to link those places together. This came up earlier in the video. You know, guys, Sanskrit and Avestan are more closely related languages. Pali and Latin are more closely related. I think Pali and Greek are more closely. Yeah. So there are kind of ethno-linguistic reasons why he would make that hypothesis. But he was actually claiming that Greece, Rome, ancient India, and ancient Iran, I totally disagree with this hypothesis, that what they had in common was this religious development. And then he starts tracing out, in a frankly dishonest and cherry-picking way, distinctive elements of religion, how religion operated at the individual level, at the family level, then at the community level, like the neighborhood level, and then at the city level, and then at the national level. And you say, okay, so this is how the whole society fit together. So one of the things to say about Numa Denis Fustel de Coulanges, this author, his later books are only in French. I believe they've never been translated into English. So I assume his later works, when he was an older man, are probably more mature and more intelligent. He was relatively young when he had this hit book. That is my guess. I would be interested to know what his later work is like, but I haven't read it. I've only read this one famous early book. And I mean, if you know enough about ancient Greece and Rome, it's a fascinating exercise to go through what he says and how he presents and misrepresents these things about religion and society and politics. But it's a kind of religion-first analysis that people participated in politics through their religion, if you like, which is largely true. I mean, religion was a huge factor right there. And yeah, it's fascinating. I also think it's totally wrong. I think his hypothesis in that book, I think what he's arguing is wrong, and how he argues it is misleading. But nevertheless, I probably refined my own view. I sharpened my own claws against the rock of Numa Denis Fustel de Coulanges' work on that, because it is a compendious work. And, you know, a lot of the stuff he quotes I've read before. He's quoting a lot of stuff out of Plutarch, which I read in like 1997 or 1999 or something. But a lot of it is quoting sources. Oh, he quotes Thucydides too, by the way. This is stuff taken out of Thucydides. So a lot of it was like, oh yeah, right. I remember when they said that about Sparta, and I remember when they said that. But yeah, that's a very different approach. You know, and I just mentioned briefly, this is a challenge. If anyone's really interested in anthropology or kind of anthropological approach to politics, you know, religion is a big deal. You know, if you want to understand politics of Egypt today or Saudi Arabia, you know, religion is a big deal. You could say that about Texas. Religion is a big deal. But, you know, it's not the only way to approach those issues. I think you can get a really brilliant explanation of the unique democratic form of government in Athens and Rome by looking at theater. Do you want to grab that book for me, babe? It's not that. I guess I don't want to rep that book. We have a book right now on theater. I shouldn't rep it because I haven't read it yet. It's probably a mediocre book. But anyway, you know, if you look at how the Greeks organized theater, how they organized sports, Olympic sports, there was voting at sport competitions. There was voting at the theater, right? And then you look at how they organized juries and trials. Wow, we've got a powerful explanation here for how the whole society worked, right? So you have a society, unlike China, unlike India, unlike Japan, where their idea of a concert is a competition between multiple musicians, and the audience votes on who gets the laurel and who wins. Voting, that audiences vote on music. That their idea of theater, you know, comedy, this is also true of tragedy, but comedy, you'd have several different comedies performed, and the audience votes, right, on who was the best performance. And now you look at how juries, how trials, how murder, and, you know, the vast majority of the cases were not murder, of course. They'd be two business associates, and one backstabbed the other, one didn't pay his debt, the other let the other down. So you're explaining a complex business relationship to an audience of like 500 people. They had hundreds of people in a jury. and the audience votes. And then you look at the Pnyx, their version of the parliament, and the audience votes. So this is a much more powerful explanation than the religious approach of Numa Denis Fustel de Coulanges. It's my theatrical approach. And now we could say something similar, mutatis mutandis, about Rome, but maybe you could also make the argument that one of the reasons why democracy was weaker in Rome was that this tradition was weaker. So in Greece, they had the Olympic Games. Those are the ones that are famous. They also had the Delphic Games. They had many different games. The Delphic Games were just as important, probably more important than the Olympic Games. Basically, they had these sporting events. You know, you can look at that. They had the theater and all this other stuff you're talking about. Rome had gladiatorial games. A little different. You know, I do think the gladiatorial games influenced. They were both influenced by and influenced. So let me just say this too. I do think you get a powerful insight into political organization and political philosophy in a society by looking at the police, the prisons, the judges, the juries, the trials. Right? Chinese political philosophy is very much interested in training the judge, right? The magistrate, if you like, the professional politician, the professional bureaucrat in China is a judge. And Chinese philosophers and authors and educators on the field, whether we're talking about Confucius or we're talking about Sun Tzu, they are really part of the process of training good men to take on the extraordinary role of being a scholar bureaucrat who can sit in judgment on his fellow men, to be a judge. So, I mean, this involves executing people. I mean, practically every sentence in ancient China ended either with you being executed, with you being tortured, or you being tattooed on your face and sent off to live a life of slavery. So the stakes are high. And their idea of being a good judge is of being intellectually pure, ritually pure, like performing a lot of rituals, knowing poetry and literature and refining your sentiments, having a certain kind of sympathy and compassion. They're concerned about that. Like, it's not, their idea of a good judge is not of a cruel and callous person. There's a lot about sentimentality. And, you know, and again, when I say religious purity, sorry, but no offense, if you haven't really studied ancient China, you have no idea what I'm talking about. The ancient Chinese idea of religious purity, it's not like Muslim purity. It's not like Christian purity. It's not like Jewish purity. They have a totally different, you know, Taoist and animist sense, this ancient Chinese religious sense, which also isn't Buddhist, by the way. It's very different from Buddhism, of what religion means and what being a good man means. So they are interested, and there is an intellectual component to that. Just being literate in classical Chinese is a huge intellectual challenge. And these men are supposed to be at this advanced level of literacy where they're reading, you know, this poetry. So they are interested in cultivating you to be a judge, to be a scholar bureaucrat. Now, I think it could be said, if we want to say something flattering about the Chinese tradition, it's something totally lacking in the West. Anyone can be a judge here. Any asshole can go to law school and become a fucking judge, and we don't care. We don't expect the judge to be a good person. You know what I mean? It's just terrible. Now, and if you think civilian trials are a joke, take a look at the military tribunal system. What a joke. We have no interest in the judge being a good person. We have no interest in the jury being a good person. Do we care if the lawyers are a good person? There are some kind of minimum standards and practices for lawyers. You know what I mean? We're really reckless on that issue, which I think is of central importance to the Chinese tradition. Now, again, in Athens, we can see this very clearly. Rome is maybe a little bit more of a mixed case because in many ways, Roman government is like a kind of decayed, corrupt, decrepit, second-rate imitation of Athenian government. Okay, but in Athenian government, it's completely clear. Anyone who has done his military service and become a citizen, so these are all men and they're not slaves and they've done their time in the army. If you've done your time in the army, you can be in the Pnyx. You can be in government. You can be a judge. And who is the judge should be selected at random. And you can be in the jury at random. That's a profound part of the Athenian tradition, right? That randomness, sortition. They even used a kind of machine. It's not worth describing, but you know, that you would be randomly assigned to the jury. You'd be randomly assigned to be a judge. And there were all kinds of situations where even the kind of magistrate in charge, the kind of president for a certain kind of political meeting, would be assigned at random too, or positions of political power, some of them lasting one day, some of them lasting 1 year, would be assigned at random. So that sense of equality and randomness, that is something that mattered. So, Francisco, I do take the time to talk to people in the audience. And, guess what, bro? Like, I can ban you. Like, I don't really get what the point is of interrupting. I do read the comments of not often. People are not really asking all the time really meaningful and salient comments where I should stop what I'm doing, to answer them. It's fine. But, sorry, just look, you can scroll up yourself. You're in the audience. You can scroll up and you can see, what people have been saying. But not all these are things. I mean, I'm in the middle of, I really just don't see the point. So someone made a comment here, 4chan is cringe. You know what I mean? Like, well, what do you want me to say in response to that? Sometimes I have a lot to say. You know what I mean? I'm in the middle of explaining something about ancient Athens. Sometimes people, are asking questions or talking to me about something relevant. Now, if you've done any of this reading, if you have anything meaningful to say, I'm happy to hear it. But, there were some comments here about the rapper Little B. I saw this stuff as it happens. I mentioned the Philippines. Someone in the audience said, I'm from the Philippines. That's nice to hear. But like, am I really going to stop what I'm saying to read that comment out and respond to it? If people are saying something meaningful, if people are saying something challenging or asking a question, I'm happy to hear it. I'm happy to respond to it. But I don't really, I just don't see the point of this kind of complaint, So anyway, anyone who's got anything to send in, by all means. And, sorry, again, if you were here at the beginning, I mean, with a long live stream like this, I realize most people in the audience now were not here when we first got started. But I've been stopping and answering what's going on. All right, shout out to Vitamin Water, who did not sponsor this video. I got my coronavirus vaccination today. So what you are witnessing right now is me under the mind-altering influence of both the coronavirus vaccine by Pfizer, also known as Pfizer, and that completely legal street drug that we hand out to children, chocolate. That's probably, so I did eat a small amount of vegan chocolate to help counteract the somewhat dizzying effect of the vaccine. Anyway, so someone's saying Isel is on the jab. That's the truth, man. I'm on the jab and I'm on the chocolate. So if you guys don't know this, but I try to have zero caffeine in my diet, and I try. When I'm sick or when I have jet lag, I will drink caffeine. But just recently, and I had coronavirus. I don't know if you guys remember that, but now more than a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, I was sick for 28 days. So there have been times when I've just given in and drank caffeine. But at the moment, I'm trying to do zero caffeine. And if you do zero caffeine, that also means zero chocolate. But today I got the jab, so I made an excuse for myself and I ate some vegan chocolate. And I'm both suffering and enjoying the side effects of having eaten chocolate. Okay, this is the first time ever in the history of the channel someone has paid to make a comment. So I don't know if you know this, Melissa. People can pay, and then their comment appears in a brightly colored box. So someone paid $5.
Wow.
We do not know if those are US dollars or Canadian dollars. I'm going to assume they're US dollars. $5. Thanks, man. You just paid for my vitamin. Yeah. And he says, quote, "Hey, Isel, been watching you for years. Excellent videos. Haha, yeah, I guess it doesn't need to be an interruption." Well, look, so I just say that's not my perspective. My perspective is if you've got something interesting to say, I'm going to stop and respond to it. But look, guys, I'm not saying this to insult my audience, but let's keep it real. Not one person said, "Oh, well, when I read Aristotle, I didn't see it that way." Not one person said, "Well, I actually differ with your interpretation of Numa Fustel de Coulanges and what he has to say about Thucydides and the differences between Roman and, ancient Greek polity." Okay, just keep it real. I'm keeping it real with you. You guys got to keep it real with yourselves. There's, during this period of time, there's been nothing really in the audience for me to, respond. It's fine. I'm not here to insult you guys, but don't insult me if I haven't stopped in the middle of saying something I think is really meaningful and important and is the topic of the video when, nobody in the audience is providing me with something, really challenging and on topic. And I have, if you've been watching since the beginning, I have several times stopped just to talk about things that are off the topic. So here, just as an example, a relatively substantive comment. Somebody asks, "What's your opinion on the Greek economic crisis?" So if you do not know, Asdif, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, we actually did go to Greece. Was more than
November, December.
Not yet 2 years ago.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah, 2019, late 2000, right? And then we were there when 2019 became 2020. Were we there for New Year? Right. Okay, we were there around Christmas or something, right? No, am I wrong?
Right before.
Okay. Right. Winter. We were there in late winter of 2019. So we actually went to Greece, and I was expecting it to be a third world country with first world pretensions. And instead, I found a first world country with third world problems. You know what I mean? It is certainly, one of the problems with 21st century politics is that people can really kid themselves about how serious political problems are. Life as normal goes on. So, the economic crisis in Greece was very real and is very real, but there is still that veneer of normalcy. I would say in Athens, especially, or at least in Athens, but I think for the whole country, where people can keep on living as normal, as if nothing's wrong, there's nothing to worry about. So I know that may not be what you were expecting me to say. I did follow very closely the Greek economic crisis back in 2007, 2008, 2009, back in that era. I was still interested in 2011. Then I did a lot of research again. I guess the question I would ask is, how bad do things have to get for people to really go back to first principles and start taking political philosophy seriously? Right now, Chile in South Africa, they are writing a new, sorry, what did I say? There you go. Thanks for catching me on that. There's a little verbal typo. Chile in South America, they're writing a new constitution. Now, I'm not optimistic about the new constitution, sadly, but I'm very happy that they are trying to solve their problems by writing a new constitution. It's very important. And Greece should have done that, and Canada should do that, and America should. A lot of countries need to write a new constitution. Now, in case you haven't heard, in Chile, it looks like the writing of the new constitution is going to be controlled by the Communist Party. They didn't get a majority of the votes, but they got a sort of plurality where they have enough votes to veto other people's suggestions or decisions. We don't know how communist their new constitution is going to be. Maybe I'm being pessimistic. It's going to turn out great, but it could be awful or it could be mediocre. But look, life in Chile is wonderful. Really, the quality of life in Chile is better than the quality of life in Canada. I'm not joking. Certainly, the quality of life for indigenous people in Chile is much better than for indigenous people in Canada. But I can list to you many, many ways in which life in Chile is better than life in Canada. So how bad did things have to get? How radicalized or discontented did people have to get in Chile before they rewrote the Constitution? Now, when I was living in Perpignan, France, which is right on the border with Spain, Spain had more than 25% unemployment, and youth unemployment was about 50%. The Spanish economy was in a total state of crisis, and we had economic refugees coming through Perpignan. There were people leaving their lives in Spain, coming to France. They normally stay in France for a short time. They'd say this is a terrible country, and they'd keep going to Germany. That was what they all ended up going to Germany. Maybe a few went to the Netherlands or something at the time, but there was this kind of economic refugee phenomenon. And I asked all the time, how bad do things have to get in Spain before people start asking these questions, coming up with new answers? So I would likewise ask the question, how bad do things have to get in Greece before people really ask fundamental questions and start coming up with fundamentally new answers? And I have a very low opinion of my fellow Canadians this way. I've certainly, it's partly out of English culture. In England, Doesn't matter. I mean, they're never going to go back to first principles and really think it's never going to happen. England will never get off their ego trip of believing they're the most wonderful country in the world to live in and things, and they're the greatest place on earth. It can be very hard for a dissident minority to shift the majority out of their complacency, to go back to the drawing board and really ask the question, what the hell are we doing here? Like, how does the police system work? How does the university education system work? Like, what do we mean by equality? What do we mean by freedom? Like the really basic fundamental questions about how government is going to work and what our priorities are too, right? So I'll just say this again. I have a whole video where I present this much more dramatically, but oh yeah, we have millions and millions of dollars to spend on space exploration. When are the indigenous people going to have schools that are equally as good as the white people? Oh, we don't have enough money for that. That's a really low priority. These things, they just don't endure scrutiny. Like just any PNYX, PNYX, if you don't know the word, look it up. Any kind of really direct democracy, open, sincere, this is not going to endure scrutiny. America, we spend billions of dollars on space exploration. People in Flint, Michigan don't have drinking water. There are these kinds of problems. Like, guys, if we just had any kind of legitimate democracy, well, look at throughout the United States of America, but including Flint, Michigan, people are expected to pay $50,000 a year for their children to get a university education. People are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on university education. This is a huge crisis, a huge problem. So, obviously, there are political solutions. There are many ways. There's not just one way to solve this problem. And I'm not even going to tell you my way is the only way or is the best way. Of course, I think my way is the best way. But I'm just not going to say that. But, regardless, the lesson of the crisis in Greece in 2008, answer this question, is that sadly a country can go through this kind of trauma, this kind of calamity, and nobody ever asks any of these questions. You don't have new questions, you don't have new answers, and nothing changes. So, how to say this, the culture of complacency endures. That's the tragic moral of the story for 2008 Greece. The 2008 crisis came and went, and, nothing changed. Okay. So we have questions. I just mentioned, I am not necessarily the source of censorship. Someone just commented, I just joined, you idiot, and Google automatically censored that. Like Google deleted that, and then I had to click to undelete it. So I'm just giving an example. Depending on your word choices, the artificial stupidity of Google's artificial intelligence system will censor you without me having to click on it. Okay, so babe, do you want to say anything? I mean, I'm ready to wrap it up. We've covered. This has been compendious, but not brief.
Well, maybe I should have said this in the middle. Maybe I should.
Do you want to come around or no?
No,
okay.
Cool. I was just thinking to myself because you were mentioning Lord Shang, and you were talking about Thucydides. So Thucydides was participating in the war. Yes. And he was actually exiled from Athens for approximately 20 years.
I forgot that. Yeah.
Okay, so this is why he had this experience to inform him of the other side.
Thucydides was exiled for 20 years. Wow. Go on, yeah.
These are,
Yeah, no, I just forgot it. I'm sure I read it too at some point.
Yeah.
I don't know everything. Go on, yeah.
Right. So he was able to observe the other side. Yeah. And I think for this reason, that's why he was.
I remember that there was some going over to the other side and seeing other things. Yeah. Right. There was some exposure to the Spartan perspective.
But I guess in a way, like I have more...
I say, Xenophon really was on the other side. He was really on the Spartan side. But I forgot that. So you're telling me Thucydides really ended up for 20 years. Okay.
Yeah.
I either forgot that or I never knew it about Thucydides. Okay, cool. I believe you.
I'm looking at my notes. I actually don't have the book anymore. That's how long ago I read it. So, but I guess what I wanted to say is that I kind of have more respect for somebody commenting on political and historical circumstances surrounding a war when they've participated. And earlier in your discussion of this, you talked about how most politicians in America and judges, for that matter, most politicians study law. Yeah. That's the trajectory. You go to university, study political science, go to law school, and then you eventually work as a politician. and that's what our representatives, that's their education. I'm not saying that there aren't any former military members in Congress or in Senate, but I found this to be like a difference between the people that were the important voices of that time. And I thought of Lord Chang as well, because he participated in war as well. So yeah, this was something I was thinking that is a difference.
I mean, so, I think you can look at political organization and political philosophy as starting with the military, starting with the need for self-defense, and then the question of how does the government pay for the military, how does the government provide a military, and who are military men, and who disciplines military men, and who do they have to do it. You can look at political organization as a series of structures on top of the military as its fundamental basis. And then, yes, you would esteem someone like Thucydides and someone like Lord Chang in China more than Socrates, for example. Right? I mean, one suggestion I'm making in this video is to instead look at the fundamental role of government, even at a tribal stage, even at the level of a tribe of nomads, not as being the military, but as being judgment, as being the judge. So you guys may not know this, but the British Empire conquered tribal peoples, people living with tribal mode of organization all over the world, in Africa and Southeast Asia. And, out in the remote areas of what's now Myanmar, then British Burma and stuff, the main interaction between those people and the government was judgment. They didn't need government. Like, they were very self-reliant. They didn't live at our quality of life, but they made their own clothes. They hunted, they farmed, they provided everything they needed for themselves in life. They didn't expect the government to provide them with an education or healthcare. They did not have any concept that the government would provide them with medicine or something, right? But there would be conflicts within those tribes. Yes, it could be something as simple as murder. I honestly doubt it would be something like that, because with murder, it's kind of straightforward. But there'd be some conflict between people in the tribe, and they would voluntarily, they would get the parties together and say, okay, let's go to the British governor. Let's go. They would call it Government House. That's a real British Empire tradition. How vague. Go to Government House and let's ask for judgment, where we will present our complaints, against one another, and government will, the governor or the government will judge us. Now, I admit this is a holotype. This is just one unique example. But I think whenever you look at tribal societies and ancient societies, even children in a schoolyard, like there are children in a schoolyard, they have a dispute or they have a conflict, and they say, okay, let's go and ask the teacher, or let's go ask the school principal to rule over us, to make a judgment. I think that is a very fundamental aspect of government. And then we kind of build up from there. I think that's kind of the one proposal of many I have in this video. Now, when you look at it that way, most of the world, China, India, Arabia, to be blunt, the Muslim world, which is now, it grew way past Arabia, but Arabia, Iraq, Iran, the central part of the Muslim world, you get a very simple answer to who is a judge, who is in charge. You know what I mean? Who rules and who is ruled. And it is brutal in its simplicity, right? And part of what's special that we see in Thucydides isn't even boasting about it. He isn't presenting it as a good thing, because Thucydides is a harsh critic of democracy, is that in ancient Athens, you have a totally different answer, right? So in ancient Athens, you have a culture, which again, even in the theater, even in sports, there's this idea of the audience voting. So the idea of the audience is already significant, right? And anyone can be in the audience, not slaves, but almost anyone. Like there are some limits, but that everyone and anyone should be prepared to step up and do their duty as a citizen and vote in the audience. This is profound, right? And then who is a judge? That this is an anonymous and interchangeable person assigned at random, assigned by law. That's a profoundly alien concept from any other culture in the world. China never thought the judge should be chosen at random. Japan never thought that. Again, you can look at Mesoamerica, pre-contact, South America or Central America or something, right? And again, if you look at Islamic jurisprudence or something, right? The ancient Buddhist world, the ancient Muslim world, none of them have this kind of, wow, so that's really different, right? And then obviously, coming out of voting, you also get elections. I mean, voting for guilty versus innocent, or voting for who is correct in a dispute between two parties, because it could be a civil case, a lawsuit, not necessarily a crime. Okay, voting and this kind of equality through anonymity and interchangeability. And again, the equality, it isn't passive. It's produced by our education. Aristotle puts a lot of emphasis on that, and by our military service. We all serve in the military. We all take responsibility together for the res publica. Republic is just res publica, for this public thing. We all take our share in that. And then out of that, you start to get these other, democratic elements. Now, okay, I'll just briefly argue against myself. I think armchair academics, it's easy for them to overlook the brutality of ancient peoples in these cultures, and the military is a huge part of that. Yeah, sorry, did you want to say more?
In Thucydides, it's filled with massacres, basically. Once an area is conquered, they kill a lot of innocent people and enslave innocent people, and so I definitely took note of that throughout reading it, that it's the ancient world, despite the positives about ancient Athenian society, despite these civilized aspects of it, there was definitely and piracy was common. And
well, I mean, in general, learning from the past forces us to confront the brutality of the past. Now, these were not societies that had a professionalized army. Again, this is really part of the origin of democracy. Everyone should be in the army. If you're not a cripple or something, you're not physically crippled, everyone's a soldier. Everyone fights for the republic. That's the Greek idea. It's also the Roman idea to a certain extent. Admittedly, Rome, it's not as perfect an example, right? But in Athens, everyone has done military service. And actually, one of the forms of corruption in Rome, which then continues on into the United States of America, in its early colonial days with the draft and so on and so on, is the idea that you could pay money to avoid doing military service yourself. You say, okay, well, I will pay like $100,000, be a significant money, for another man to do military service on my behalf. And that happened during the American Revolution. There were rich men who paid money to not fight against the British. They were furnishing money that could be used to fight against them. To get a paid deferment this way. In the Napoleonic Wars and stuff, that idea hangs on a long time. Well, my money fights for me. The people of a certain social class, by the way. But no, I mean, in Athens, this is the unifying element. But in my recent critique of Woody Holton and the other books I've been reading about American political history, American Constitution, and Revolution, and so on. Something comes up again, just when I'm talking to Melissa and stuff, it's like, you can't forget, you can't ignore the brutality of these people. These were people who had committed torture with their own hands. They committed murder with their own hands. They had whipped slaves. They had participated in they had the experience of war and of tremendous violence in peacetime that today is highly professionalized. Now, I mean, some of you guys, you might have picked up on this with me. I am relatively sympathetic towards the CIA. I am not one of these guys who kind of blames the CIA for everything. I know the CIA kills people. You know what I mean? I think, again, when you see it in this more centuries-long, millennia-long way, looking over time, you can see like, these are the parts of our society that are still carrying on that ancient brutality. Like now there's a small professional service that engages in subterfuge and skullduggery and murder, frankly. I don't know any other word for it. Okay, so the CIA, these are this small number of professionals who are still living that way. But no, when you were looking at ancient Athens and so on, the brutality of that. And sorry, just something else. Again, this is something I've talked about most before. You can't underestimate the element of risk and threat in participating in those democratic forums. People weren't just shy. When people stood up to speak at the Pnyx, they were risking their lives. So that was different from, speaking in the theater. If you were going to speak in a real political debate, I would say this is true of Rome too, frankly, to some extent. But you were putting your neck on the line, and if you lied or seemed dishonest or made statements that didn't make any sense, it wouldn't just be your reputation that suffered. You could physically suffer consequences if you were, again, even if you weren't actually a corrupt or dishonest person in politics, but if you were perceived to be, that could have terrible consequences for you. So if the audience demanded you this of you, that's another thing. Okay, guys. So from my perspective, I'm coming to the end of this live stream. I started by typing out the title, and I think we have fulfilled the remit of the subject being discussed in the title. And again, a spontaneous discussion, but it's a spontaneous discussion of things that Melissa has been reading about for 3 years, and I've been reading about for I don't know how many decades. With Thucydides itself, so I guess I should finish that story. I started telling the story of how I first heard about Thucydides. There's a wonderful photograph of me lying with my daughter on my chest, my infant newborn daughter on my chest. And the first time I read Thucydides, it was really on my list of things to get around to for a couple years, not for that many years, but it was when my daughter was a newborn baby. So when my daughter was a newborn baby and I was holding her, I read Thucydides. And that was, you can see in the picture, it's not that thick a book. It's an edited down version of the text. That was my first version of the text. Then later I did read the whole text and I listened to it as an audio book. At that time, also in Take Care of My Daughter, I listened to the whole of Herodotus, not edited down. I read the complete unexpurgated text of Herodotus. I listened to as an audio book, mostly when cleaning. So, my daughter would fall asleep all the time. So you'd rock the baby, she'd fall asleep. She was asleep, you'd put her down, you put on the audio book, start cleaning, or maybe cooking, but cooking or cleaning and stuff. Baby wake up, go back and play with the baby, this kind of thing. So actually for me, both Thucydides and Herodotus, that's linked to my experience of caring for my daughter during her first year of life. And at the time, I remember saying to my ex-wife, I was like, my whole life would be different if I'd read this earlier. If I'd read this when I was in high school or something, everything would be different for me. Thucydides especially, but putting together Thucydides and Herodotus, and now of course it's funny. I read those things as an old man with my daughter in my arms at a stage when I already had all this other political knowledge. It's been discussed this way. I already knew about China and India and Southeast Asia and all kinds of, and I knew about the French Revolution, and I knew about all kinds of stuff in politics, and I'd already read a lot of stuff from ancient Greece and ancient Rome too. I'd read Aristotle and all kinds of other sources, but it was in some ways inspiring and in some ways saddening to reflect on how different my whole life would have been if I had read Thucydides back when I was a teenager, and what different decisions I'd made. And it leads you to have, an appreciation for the topic of this video. What is uniquely important about this cultural, political, and philosophical legacy of the West?